At a bustling cafe, a spirited young woman named Ashley scoffs at an older gentleman's medal of honor. "A shiny trinket for a bloody past," she sneers, her words sharp as knives. The man, silenced by the sting of her remark, places the medal gently on the table and walks away. What unfolds next, a revelation of courage, loss, and love, will melt even the hardest heart, proving that the weight of sacrifice is far heavier than it seems. The morning sun streamed through the glass windows of the Cornerstone Café, illuminating the chatter and hum of its early patrons. Ashley Reed sat at her usual spot by the window, her latte steaming as she typed furiously on her laptop. Her auburn hair was tied in a loose bun, a few strands falling over her face as her fingers moved with purpose. Her latest piece, a fiery op-ed about the glorification of war, was nearing completion, and her smirk widened with every word she typed. Across the room, the soft jingle of bells announced the arrival of a new customer. Heads turned briefly and then returned to their business. An elderly man entered the cafe, his posture slightly stooped but his presence commanding. He wore a faded bomber jacket that had seen better days, and around his neck hung a gleaming medal of honor. The man moved with deliberate slowness, as though each step carried the weight of years gone by. Thomas Calloway, a veteran in his late 70s, approached the counter to order his coffee, oblivious to the glances his medal drew. Ashley noticed him immediately. The sunlight streaming through the windows caught the medal, making it shine almost defiantly in the cozy cafe. She squinted at it, her smirk turning into a disdainful chuckle. "A shiny trinket for a bloody past," she muttered under her breath. Her friend Mia, sitting across from her, looked up from her tea. "What's got you riled up this time?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Ashley tilted her head toward Thomas. "Look at that. Parading around with a medal like he's some kind of hero. Do you know how many lives were probably destroyed so he could earn that thing? It's disgusting." Mia frowned but said nothing. She had learned to pick her battles with Ashley, whose passionate opinions often left little room for debate. Ashley, however, was just getting started. Her fingers hovered over her laptop for a moment before she closed it with a decisive snap. "I'm going to say something," she announced, standing abruptly. "Ash, maybe don't," Mia began, but Ashley was already halfway to the counter. Thomas was patiently waiting for his coffee when Ashley approached him, her arms crossed and her eyes sharp. "Excuse me," she said, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby patrons. "That's quite the accessory you've got. Does it come with a story, or is it just for show?" Thomas turned slowly, his weathered face calm but his eyes clouded with confusion. "It's a medal of honor," he said simply, his voice gravelly but steady. Ashley crossed her arms tighter. "Oh, I know what it is. I just wonder what it feels like to wear something that represents so much death and destruction. Proud, are you?" The cafe grew quieter as conversations faltered and heads turned toward the unfolding scene. Thomas regarded Ashley for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "It's not about pride," he said, his voice steady but soft. "It's about remembering." Ashley raised an eyebrow, her tone turning sharp. Remembering what? The lives lost because of senseless wars? The families torn apart? The innocent people caught in the crossfire? Thomas placed his coffee cup gently on the counter and reached for the medal around his neck. Slowly, he unclasped it and held it out in his trembling hands. "Do you want to know what this is?" he asked, his voice tinged with sorrow. "It's not a trophy. It's a weight. I carry it every day to remember the men who didn't come home. My best friend, Caleb. He gave his life so others could live. This medal isn't for me. It's for him." Ashley faltered, her retort caught in her throat. For the first time, she noticed the deep lines etched into Thomas's face, the way his hands trembled as he spoke, but her indignation wouldn't let her back down. "Well, maybe if people like you had refused to fight in the first place, Caleb would still be alive." A collective gasp rippled through the cafe. Thomas's hands trembled as he clasped the medal back around his neck. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, his steps heavy and deliberate. The bell jingled as he left, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Ashley stood frozen for a moment before returning to her seat. Her chest heaved with emotions she couldn't quite place. Mia stared at her, wide-eyed. "That was harsh, even for you," Mia said softly. Ashley shrugged, though her hands trembled as she reached for her coffee. "Someone has to call them out," she muttered, more to herself than to Mia, but the image of Thomas's haunted eyes lingered in her mind, unsettling her confidence. Outside, Thomas paused on the sidewalk. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. As he opened it, his hands steadied, and his eyes softened. It was a letter, its edges worn from years of being handled. He read it silently, his lips moving as he traced the familiar words. Then, with a sigh, he tucked it back into his pocket and walked on, disappearing into the morning crowd. Inside the cafe, Ashley watched him go, a strange ache settling in her chest. She didn't know it yet, but this encounter would set in motion a journey that would change her life forever. Ashley couldn't shake the encounter. For the rest of the day, her mind replayed Thomas's trembling voice and haunted eyes. Why couldn't she let it go? She had been right, hadn't she? War destroyed lives, and medals were just symbols to mask its horrors. Yet something about Thomas stuck with her, gnawed at her thoughts in a way she couldn't ignore. Later that evening, Ashley unpacked her laptop at home and noticed a folded piece of paper tucked beside it. She didn't remember picking it up but opened it anyway, curiosity winning out. The paper revealed a letter, its edges yellowed and worn, the handwriting shaky but deliberate. "Dear Sarah," it began. Ashley hesitated, her chest tightening. The name alone felt intimate. Was this Thomas's letter? Had he dropped it in the cafe? She read on, her curiosity turning to an ache she didn't expect. The letter spoke of a promise, a vow Thomas had made to honor his fallen comrades. It described Caleb, the friend he had mentioned, in vivid detail, a young man with an infectious laugh who had died shielding Thomas from a grenade blast. The guilt, Thomas wrote, had never left him. "I lived because of him," the letter read. "I swore I'd spend my life remembering him." It also mentioned Sarah, the love of my life, who couldn't wait for him to return from war. By the time Thomas made it back, she had moved on, unwilling to live in the shadow of someone changed by battle. "I don't blame her," Thomas wrote, "but sometimes I wonder, if I had been stronger, braver, would Caleb still be here? Would Sarah?" Ashley set the letter down, her hands trembling. The room was silent, but her mind raced. She didn't know why, but the words had pierced something deep inside her. Grabbing her phone, she dialed Mia. "I think I found something important," Ashley said when Mia answered. "We need to talk." The next morning, Ashley and Mia met at a diner. The letter lay on the table between them as Mia read it silently. Her expression softened into sadness. "This is heavy," Mia said, setting the letter down. "How did you get it?" "I think he dropped it," Ashley replied. "Or maybe I picked it up by mistake. I don't know." Mia looked at her, puzzled. "And now what? What are you going to do?" Ashley hesitated. She didn't have a clear plan, only an overwhelming need to return the letter, and to apologize. "I need to find him," she said finally. "I need to give this back." "And then what?" Mia pressed. "Say sorry for what you said at the cafe?" Ashley shrugged. "Maybe, I don't know." Finding Thomas wasn't easy. The cafe staff knew little about him, and her online searches turned up nothing useful. Finally, at the local Veterans Center, Ashley found someone who recognized him. "Thomas Calloway?" the receptionist asked. "Yeah, I know him. He comes in for support groups sometimes. Good man. but quiet. Ashley left her contact information and asked the receptionist to pass along her message. Days passed with no response, and Ashley began to wonder if Thomas even cared to see her again. Then, just as she was starting to give up, her phone buzzed with a text. "This is Thomas Calloway. I understand you're looking for me. Meet me at the Veterans Memorial tomorrow at noon." Ashley stared at the message, her heart pounding. She typed back quickly, "I'll be there." The next day, Ashley stood in front of the Veterans Memorial, clutching the letter tightly. The air was crisp and the leaves rustled softly in the breeze. She spotted Thomas sitting on a bench, his bomber jacket shielding him from the chill. He looked up as she approached, his expression calm but guarded. "You found my letter," Thomas said as she neared. "I did," Ashley replied, her voice low. "I wanted to return it. And I wanted to say I'm sorry." Thomas nodded slowly and patted the bench beside him. "Sit," he said. Ashley sat down, the letter trembling in her hands. "I didn't understand," she began, her voice breaking. "When I said those things, I didn't know. About Caleb. About you." Thomas studied her for a moment before speaking. "You were angry. I've seen that before, but it doesn't make the past less real." Ashley felt a lump rise in her throat. "I read your letter. I hope that's okay." Thomas nodded again. "Caleb was a good man. Better than me in every way. He didn't deserve to die, but he did, and I've spent every day since trying to make peace with that." Ashley blinked back tears. She wanted to say something profound, something that would ease the burden Thomas carried, but no words felt adequate. Instead, she handed him the letter. "I shouldn't have kept this," she said. "It belongs with you." Thomas took it from her, his hand steady now. "Maybe it doesn't," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time someone else carries the memory." Ashley didn't know what he meant, but as they sat in silence, she felt something shift inside her, a weight she hadn't realized she carried lifting ever so slightly. This was only the beginning, she knew, but it was a start. The morning after meeting Thomas, Ashley woke up restless. She couldn't stop thinking about him, his words, his grief, the letter that had felt so heavy in her hands. She had returned it, apologized, and yet a part of her felt unfinished, as though their conversation had only scratched the surface of something deeper. Sitting at her desk, she stared at her blank laptop screen. She wanted to write, but every time she began, she stopped. Was it even her story to tell? Later that afternoon, Ashley met Mia at the park. They sat under a tree, the sun filtering through the leaves as Ashley recounted her conversation with Thomas and her dilemma. "I think you should write about it," Mia said, leaning forward. "Not to exploit him, but to tell people the truth. How many veterans are out there like Thomas, carrying invisible weights that no one ever sees?" Ashley frowned. "But what if it hurts him? What if it reopens wounds he's spent years trying to close?" Mia was quiet for a moment. "Then ask him," she said. "Talk to him about it. If he says no, you let it go. But if he says yes, maybe it's worth it." That evening, Ashley sat in her room, staring at her phone. The idea of reaching out to Thomas again made her nervous, but Mia was right. If she was going to write about him, she needed his consent. Taking a deep breath, she typed out a message. "I was wondering if we could meet again. I have something I'd like to ask you." Thomas's reply came quickly. "Same place, same time tomorrow." The next day, Ashley arrived at the Veterans Memorial early, her notebook and pen in hand. She spotted Thomas on the same bench, his bomber jacket making him easy to recognize. He looked up as she approached. "Back so soon?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. Ashley sat down beside him. "I wanted to ask you something," she said. "I'm a writer. I write about things people don't usually talk about. Your story. I think it's something people need to hear, but only if you're okay with it." Thomas was silent for a long time. his gaze fixed on the memorial in front of them. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but measured. "Why do you want to tell it?" he asked. Ashley hesitated. She hadn't expected the question, but now that it was asked, she realized she knew the answer. "Because I was wrong," she admitted. "I judged you without knowing anything about you, and I think a lot of people do the same. If sharing your story can help people understand, maybe it's worth it." Thomas's lips pressed into a thin line. "I've spent most of my life trying to forget parts of my story," he said. "But forgetting doesn't make it go away. If you think it will make a difference, you can write it. But there's one condition." Ashley straightened. "Of course. What is it?" "Don't make me a hero," Thomas said firmly. "I'm not one, and I don't want people to think I am. The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home." Ashley nodded, her throat tightening. "I promise." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Ashley threw herself into research, spending hours at the local veterans center talking to others who had served. She learned about their struggles, their losses, and the ways they coped or didn't. She wove their stories together with Thomas's, crafting a piece that was longer and more personal than anything she had written before. For the first time, she wasn't writing to argue or convince. She was writing to understand. Thomas read the final draft before it was published. They met at the memorial again, where he sat with his reading glasses perched on his nose, silently taking in every word. When he finished, he handed the pages back to Ashley without a word. "Well?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Thomas gave her a small, approving nod. "It's honest," he said. "That's all I wanted." The article, titled "The Weight of a Medal," was published online and quickly gained traction. It wasn't just about Thomas, it was about all the veterans who carried their sacrifices silently, without recognition or understanding. The response was overwhelming. Comments flooded in from readers who shared their own stories, their own pain. For the first time, Ashley felt like her words had truly made a difference. A month later, Ashley was invited to speak at a local event honoring veterans. Thomas encouraged her to accept. "You have a voice," he told her. "Use it." The event was held in a small auditorium, its walls lined with photographs and flags. Ashley stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she addressed the audience. She spoke about Thomas, about Caleb, and about the letter that had changed everything. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on, determined to honor their story. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Ashley felt a wave of emotion she couldn't quite name, pride, perhaps, but also humility. She spotted Thomas in the audience, his expression calm but his eyes soft. After the event, Thomas approached her. "You did good, kid," he said. Ashley smiled, a lump rising in her throat. "Thank you for trusting me." Thomas shook his head. "Thank you for listening." Walking home that evening, Ashley felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. She had started this journey with anger and judgment, but it had led her somewhere entirely different. Some stories, she realized, aren't meant to be shouted. They're meant to be shared, carried, and honored. The day after the event, Ashley received an unexpected text from Thomas. "Meet me at the cafe where we first crossed paths. Noon. I have something to show you." Curiosity tugged at her all morning. She had just started to feel closure, but the message made her wonder if Thomas had more to share. By the time she arrived, Thomas was already seated, his bomber jacket draped over the chair beside him. On the table was a small, leather-bound journal. "You're early," Thomas remarked as she approached. "I could say the same about you," Ashley replied with a small smile. She sat across from him, eyeing the journal. "Is that what you wanted to show me?" Thomas nodded, sliding it across the table. "This belonged to Caleb," he said. "I've kept it all these years, but I think it's time someone else reads it." Ashley hesitated. "Are you sure? It feels personal." "It is," Thomas admitted, "but I think you've earned the right to see it. Caleb always wanted people to know who he really was, not just a name on a gravestone. This is the best way I know to honor him. That evening, Ashley sat at her desk, the journal resting in front of her. She opened it slowly, the scent of aged paper filling the air. The first page was dated a week before Caleb and Thomas deployed. It was filled with musings about home, family, and the fear of the unknown. As she read, Ashley felt herself drawn into Caleb's world. His words were raw and honest, full of hope but also doubt. He wrote about dreams of becoming a teacher, his love for his sister, and his determination to return home and make a difference. But as the entries progressed, optimism gave way to frustration, exhaustion, and sorrow. Caleb wrote about the friends they lost, the horrors they witnessed, and the guilt of surviving when others hadn't. The final entry stopped Ashley cold. It was dated just a day before Caleb's death. "If something happens to me," it read, "I hope someone remembers I wasn't just a soldier. I was a son, a brother, a dreamer. I hope my life meant something." Ashley closed the journal, her chest heavy. Caleb's words echoed in her mind, a reminder of the humanity often overshadowed by war's brutality. She realized her work wasn't finished. Telling Thomas's story had been just the beginning. Caleb's story needed to be told too. The next morning, Ashley called Thomas. "Thank you for trusting me with Caleb's journal," she said. "I think his story deserves to be shared." Thomas was silent. "You think people would care?" he asked quietly. "I know they would," Ashley replied. "His words are powerful. They show the human side of war, the part people don't often see. I want to honor him the way you have." Thomas sighed. "All right, but promise me one thing. Don't sugarcoat it. Caleb was a good man, but he wasn't perfect. Let people see him for who he really was." "I promise," Ashley said. Over the next weeks, Ashley worked tirelessly. She combed through Caleb's journal, weaving his words into a narrative that captured his essence. She spoke with Thomas frequently, filling in the gaps and learning about the bond they shared. Caleb's story was one of courage, yes, but also of vulnerability and humanity. It was about a man who had dreams and fears, who had laughed and cried, who had lived and loved. When the piece was finished, Ashley sent it to Thomas before submitting it. She waited anxiously for his feedback, unsure of how he would react. When Thomas finally called, his voice was thick with emotion. "You did good," he said simply. Caleb would be proud. The article, titled "More Than a Soldier: The Life of Caleb Myers," was published in a major online magazine. Like her previous piece, it struck a chord with readers. People from all walks of life reached out, sharing stories of loved ones who had served, who had lived, who had been more than their titles. Caleb's story became a symbol of the humanity behind the uniform, a reminder that every soldier was a person first. For Thomas, the article was cathartic. He began attending support groups more regularly, opening up in ways he never had before. For Ashley, it was transformative. She realized her work wasn't just about telling stories. It was about giving people a voice, helping others see the world through a different lens. Months later, Ashley and Thomas visited Caleb's grave together. It was a quiet, overcast day, the kind Caleb had described in his journal as his favorite weather. Ashley knelt beside the headstone, placing a single white rose at its base. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for everything." Thomas stood silently beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. They stayed there for a long time, the silence between them filled with understanding. As they left the cemetery, Thomas turned to Ashley. "You've done more for Caleb than I ever could," he said. Ashley shook her head. "No, you kept his memory alive. I just helped share it." Thomas smiled faintly. "He'd like you," he said. "He always had a thing for writers." Ashley laughed softly, the sound carrying on the wind. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. Caleb's story had been told, and with it, a piece of her own story had found its place as well. Months after Caleb's story was published, Ashley reflected on how much had changed. Her work had gained new purpose, rooted in storytelling that gave voice to the unseen and unheard. Responses to More Than a Soldier hadn't stopped. Emails, comments, and letters flooded in from readers who had connected with Caleb's words, or simply wanted to say thank you. But the most surprising change was her relationship with Thomas. What had started as conflict in a cafe had become a deep friendship. They met regularly, at the memorial, for coffee, or just to talk. Thomas had become a mentor, guiding Ashley in ways she hadn't expected. One afternoon, as they sat on the bench at the memorial, Ashley asked, "Do you ever feel like there's more you could do? Like Caleb's story was just the beginning?" Thomas nodded. "I think about it all the time," he admitted, "but I'm not sure where to start." Ashley glanced at him thoughtfully. "What if we did something together? Something bigger? You've spent your life honoring Caleb. Maybe now it's time to honor all the others, too." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" "A space for people to share their stories," Ashley said. "Veterans, their families, anyone affected by war. A place where people can feel seen and heard." Thomas was quiet, his gaze fixed on the names etched into the memorial. Finally, he said, "I like the sound of that." The idea took shape quickly. With Thomas's connections in the veterans community and Ashley's growing platform, they began creating the Voices of Valor, a digital space where stories of sacrifice, resilience, and humanity could be shared and preserved. The work was daunting. They spent weeks reaching out to veterans, collecting submissions, and building the website. Ashley interviewed dozens of people, each story unique and heartbreaking. There was the single mother raising 3 children alone after losing her husband in Iraq, the Vietnam veteran who hadn't spoken about his experiences until now, and the young man who enlisted to escape poverty, only to lose his best friend in combat. Thomas, too, opened up in ways he hadn't before. He wrote his own story for the site, candidly recounting his time in the military, his struggles with guilt, and Caleb's legacy. When Ashley read it, she couldn't hold back her tears. "This will help so many people," she told him. The Voices of Valor launched on Memorial Day. Within hours, the site was flooded with visitors. Stories poured in, some long and detailed, others just a few sentences. But each carried the weight of a life lived, a loss felt, or a memory cherished. Ashley and Thomas were overwhelmed by the response. News outlets picked up the story, and soon they were speaking at events and sharing their mission with a wider audience. But the most meaningful moments came from quiet messages of gratitude. "Thank you for giving us a voice," one woman wrote. "For the first time, I feel like someone is listening." Months later, Thomas approached Ashley with a new idea. "What if we turned this into something tangible? A book, something people can hold, pass down, something that lasts." Ashley's eyes lit up. "A collection of stories?" Thomas nodded. "The best of them. Caleb's, too. It could be our way of making sure these stories aren't forgotten." They began working on the book immediately. It was a labor of love, one that brought them even closer. Ashley handled the writing and editing, while Thomas reached out to contributors for permissions and additional details. When the manuscript was finished, they titled it More Than Names: The Stories Behind the Sacrifice. It was published before Veterans Day and quickly became a bestseller. Proceeds were donated to organizations supporting veterans and their families, a decision that felt right to both of them. On the day of the book's launch, Thomas stood at the podium, a copy in his hands. The room was packed with veterans, families, and readers. His voice was steady as he spoke, but Ashley could see the emotion in his eyes. "This book isn't about me," he said. "It's about all of us. The ones who served, the ones who waited, the ones we lost. It's about remembering that behind every name is a story, and every story matters." The room erupted into applause. Ashley felt a lump rise in her throat as she joined in. She couldn't have imagined all those months ago where that first encounter at the cafe would lead. But as she looked at Thomas, the crowd, and the book they had created, she knew this was just the beginning. Later that evening, Ashley and Thomas sat on the steps of the event hall, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. "You know," Ashley said, "if Caleb could see all this, I think he'd be proud." Thomas smiled faintly. "I like to think he's watching," he said, "and I think he'd like you." Ashley laughed softly. "You always say that." "Because it's true," Thomas replied. "You've done more than honor Caleb, Ashley. You've made sure none of us are forgotten." Ashley shook her head. "I couldn't have done it without you." They sat in silence, the weight of the moment settling around them. It wasn't closure. There would always be pain, always loss. But it was something close, something like peace. A year after the launch of More Than Names, Ashley stood on the stage of a packed auditorium, her hands clutching the podium. The room was quiet, the audience waiting. She glanced at the crowd. Veterans, families, supporters, and countless others who had been touched by the stories shared through the voices of valor. Thomas sat in the front row, his hands folded in his lap, his expression calm but proud. Ashley took a deep breath. "When I started this journey," she began, her voice steady but soft, "I had no idea where it would lead. It began with a moment of anger, of misunderstanding. But that moment opened a door to stories I didn't know existed, stories that have changed my life and, I hope, the lives of so many others." Her speech wasn't long, but it was heartfelt. She spoke about Caleb, about Thomas, and about the countless others who had shared their stories through the project. "This is about more than remembering," she said. "It's about seeing. It's about listening. It's about making sure no one is forgotten." The applause that followed was thunderous. Ashley stepped back, her heart full as Thomas joined her on stage. He said little, as was his way, but his presence was enough. Together they received an award recognizing the impact of their work, a small plaque that, to Ashley, felt heavier than any trophy. Later that evening, Ashley and Thomas returned to the Veterans Memorial. The sun had set, and the memorial was bathed in soft light. They walked in silence, the weight of the day settling around them. "Do you think we've done enough?" Ashley asked suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet. Thomas stopped, his gaze fixed on the memorial. "It's never enough," he said, "but it's something. And something is better than nothing." Ashley nodded, her eyes misting. "I just wish Caleb could have seen all this." "He does," Thomas said quietly. "I know he does." They stood there for a long moment before Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and round. He held it out to Ashley, a Medal of Honor, its ribbon frayed at the edges. "This was Caleb's," he said. "They gave it to his family after he died. His sister gave it to me years later. She said I was the one who really kept his memory alive." Ashley stared at the medal, her heart pounding. "Thomas, I can't." "You can," he interrupted. "You've done more for Caleb than I ever could. This belongs with you now." Ashley hesitated, her hands trembling as she took the medal. It felt impossibly heavy, its weight a reminder of the sacrifice it represented. "I'll treasure it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Thomas smiled faintly. "You earned it." In the weeks that followed, Ashley placed Caleb's Medal of Honor in a shadow box, along with a photograph of him and a handwritten note from Thomas. She hung it on the wall above her desk, where she could see it every day. It became a source of inspiration, a reminder of why she wrote, of why the stories mattered. The work continued. The voices of valor grew, expanding into schools, libraries, and community centers. Ashley and Thomas traveled across the country, speaking to students, veterans, and anyone willing to listen. Each trip brought new stories, new connections, and new reasons to keep going. One of the most impactful visits was to a small high school, where a group of students had used the Voices of Valor to research their family histories. One student tearfully shared how her grandfather, a World War II veteran, had never spoken of his service until he read Caleb's story. He said it reminded him that his story mattered, too, she told them. On the second anniversary of Caleb's death, Ashley and Thomas returned to his grave. The day was overcast, a light drizzle falling as they stood in silence. Ashley placed a white rose at the base of the headstone, her heart heavy but full. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Thomas stood beside her, his hands in his pockets. "He'd be proud," he said. Ashley nodded, unable to speak. They stayed there for a long time before finally walking back to the car. As they drove away, Ashley glanced back one last time, the headstone growing smaller in the distance. Years later, Ashley sat in her home office, a new book manuscript open on her computer. The house was quiet, the only sound the tapping of her fingers on the keyboard. Thomas had passed away the year before, leaving a void in her life that could never be filled. But his legacy lived on, in the Voices of Valor, in the books they had created, and in the countless lives they had touched. On her desk, the shadow box with Caleb's Medal of Honor sat in its usual place. Ashley glanced at it, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "We did it," she whispered. "We really did it." She finished typing the final sentence of her manuscript, a memoir about her journey with Thomas, Caleb, and the stories that had shaped her life. As she hit save, a sense of peace washed over her. It wasn't closure, there would always be pain, always loss, but it was something close, something like hope.